Good afternoon. Welcome to Law Power Hour. I'm pleased to have today Mr. Gerald Hudson with us. Mr. Hudson, thank you for coming down.
Thank you for inviting me.
Mr. Hudson has retired from the city of Detroit, but he had a very interesting position. He was a senior legal attorney, senior legal assistant with the city of Detroit for about 23, 24 years, and he knows all about licensing. He's written many of the ordinances for the city of Detroit, and I thought it would be a good idea to have him on today because there are a lot of changes going on in the city and folks want to start up businesses. So I thought we would pick his brain today since he's a knowledgeable individual in this field and help us explore what we have to do to go into business. Can you help us?
Yes, I can. I can try.
Okay, well, we're going to just start out with a couple different fact scenarios, and if people call in, hopefully they'll call and ask some questions, and we'll get some rules down here about starting a business in the city. Now, there's certain kinds of business that you have to have a license for in the city, correct?
That is correct.
And there are certain kinds of businesses that you have to license in the city and the state, correct?
That is correct also.
Okay, now I get you to the third scenario. There's certain types of businesses not only need a license in the city and a license in the state, but you also need approval from the health department to go into business.
That is correct, and that's tied into the state law requirements as far as having the appropriate state license.
Okay, now let's talk about some of the businesses in the city that you need a license for. I'm a taxi cab driver and I'm operating in the city of Detroit. Do I need a license?
Yes, you do.
And if you don't have a license in the city of Detroit, what happens?
You can be ticketed for operating without a license. Not only do you have to have the license for the taxi cab, but the taxi cab driver has to be licensed.
And there's a special fee for that, isn't there?
That is correct.
It's not the normal fee that someone would pay just, you know, to operate a vehicle, like going down to the Department of Motor Vehicle, getting a registration, proof of insurance. You have to pay a special fee to bring folks in your car, right?
That is correct. I mean, there's a plate that's attached to your motor vehicle.
And is there a special charge for that plate?
Oh, yes. The Detroit Police Department will issue that plate, which is attached to your car.
Now, if I have that plate, what does it give me the right to do?
Basically, to pick up and discharge passengers within the city.
And who sets the rate for the fares?
There is an ordinance that regulates the rate that you can charge for a person to be in your taxi cab.
Okay, now I've got an interesting question to ask you. And I asked you this off the air. Up comes this business called Uber. And, you know, I can call up Uber and say, I want to drive for you, and maybe they'll do a background check on me, maybe they won't do a background check. But as long as I can prove that I own my vehicle or lease it and I have insurance and a decent driving record, maybe I can go to work for Uber. Do I need a license?
At this time, there is not a City of Detroit license for someone who operates with Uber. There has been a discussion. This is a national issue as far as operating within a city limit without a taxi cab license or a license to transport passengers within that city. It's being litigated in different jurisdictions, and the city of Detroit has basically allowed Uber to operate within the city, and that's up to Uber to make sure that those drivers have the appropriate insurance and the license.
But that isn't fair to the cab drivers who have to pay for this medallion or this special license, is it?
That is correct. I would say it's unfair in the sense that they are not licensed by the city at this time.
And you know, I'm not asking you to say that this is legal or illegal. I want you to understand that, okay? I don't want to put you on the spot today. But you can say whatever you want in terms of an opinion if you choose to. So we've talked about Uber now. Let's say I decide to open a business in my house and I'm going to do barbering, cosmetology. Do I need a license to do that?
You need a license to operate as a barber in the city of Detroit, but at your house, that's prohibited under the zoning ordinance. You cannot operate a business as such in your home.
Tell me why, so we understand. Because there's a lot of folks who have cottage industries going on, and nobody knows about them except the folks who know how to get to the houses and get their hair cut or get a
Well,
manicure.
well, the city of Detroit has it, it's been zoned, and there are several different zoning districts, and there's a residential zoning, R1, R2, and that's primarily for residential purposes, not for commercial purposes. So if you want to operate a barber shop, you're supposed to be operating in a commercial district or a business district, and that may be a B1 or a B2.
Okay? So if you're operating in an R1 or an R2 district, you need a special license to do that or a variance of some kind?
You probably could not get a variance to operate a commercial establishment in a residential. The zoning code has different provisions for variances, but it sets forth a scheme whereby you probably could not get a variance to operate a business in a residential neighborhood.
Okay, I want to open up a retail shop in the city of Detroit. Do I need a license to open a retail shop?
Depends on what you are retailing.
Having trouble with the connection.
Okay, if I'm
Yeah.
going to open up a clothing store in the city of Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
do I need to get a license from the city?
No, but your building would have to be inspected by the buildings department, and you'd have to have an occupancy permit. And if you're just selling regular clothing, I would say that you would not need there's not a specific business license for that.
Now, in terms of an occupancy permit, could you explain how that works? I'm going to go get a building here on Woodward Avenue now. Things are changing in the city. I want to open up a clothing store. So I need an occupancy permit.
That's correct. You would go to the buildings department, and just as far as your building would have to be in compliance with the electrical code, the plumbing code, and any other type of code that might be applicable. Mechanical code, if there's a furnace, air conditioning there, you'd have to have all those things in place and inspected by the city.
And if the city code required me to have laboratory facilities for my customers that are coming into the store, I'd have to have those, right?
That's correct.
And if I didn't have all of those permits and I opened my business, what would happen?
Well, the buildings department would say you may have to close until you comply with the different ordinances and state laws to have legal occupancy of that building.
Now, you wrote some of the ordinances in the city, didn't you?
Over my 20-year experience, I did draft several ordinances with the city of Detroit.
Did you ever write any ordinances for food service?
Well, I tweaked the chapter 21 of the Detroit City Code that regulates food service establishments, and I also I'm sorry. What?
No, go ahead. I want to hear about that. You said you tweaked Chapter 21. What's that about?
Well, that basically regulates the operation of restaurants within the city of Detroit, and it also deals with the health department requirements.
Okay. There's an interplay between the ordinances that require you to have a license to operate in the health department, correct?
Very often there is.
I mean,
And,
I'm talking about food service, for
right,
example.
exactly. There's a licensing scheme by the state of Michigan whereby you have to have a food service establishment license to operate within the city. And what happens is that you have to apply for that, but you also have to have a City of Detroit business license. And if you have other activities within that building, say a bar, you may have to have a cabaret license also.
Okay. So if I decide in my neighborhood that I'm going to run Barry's Kitchen out the back door, I can't do it, can I?
Not in the residential, no, you cannot do that.
But I also have to have a food handler's permit, don't I?
Well, several years ago, that requirement was basically dropped. It was still in the city ordinance, but the state of Michigan did not require you to have a food handler's permit. The city of Detroit used to conduct classes for that, but it's my understanding like currently you do not have to have an individual. Each employee does not necessarily have to have a permit as such, but someone on the establishment must be trained in the food service laws.
Okay, when you say trained in the food service laws, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, there's lots of regulations that deal with safe handling of food. All this is regulated by the state of Michigan. So you have to have a supervisor or some person on premises who is very familiar with those requirements of the health laws.
So, in your work with the city, did you get into the administration of this area?
Primarily dealing with the issuance of a business license. I would work with restaurants as far as coming into compliance with the city ordinances in order for them to get a food service license from the state of Michigan and also the city license.
If I wanted to get a food service license, where would I go in the city to get it?
Well, that's the business license is issued by the Business License Center, which is on the fourth floor of the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center building.
Okay, now, if I go to the fourth floor and say I want to get a business license, say to open up a restaurant, do I have to bring anything with me?
Well, you should have started probably with the state of Michigan also, because you have to have that state license also. But when you have to come, when you go down to the city of Detroit, they'll ask for, if it's a corporation, they'll want to see the corporation papers. You'll have to have some ownership of the building itself or a lease, and you have to fill out an application and pay a fee to get your business license.
Okay, and then after I get my business license, if I want to open a coffee shop there, do I have to have it inspected and approved? I mean, believe it or not, these are real important questions because there's a lot of folks that want to start businesses.
Well, if the coffee shop is contained within the restaurant, you wouldn't need a separate license to sell
Oh,
coffee.
let's
But,
say I go down the street and I'm in the university district. I want to open a coffee shop.
Oh, yeah. Same process. You would have to get a business license, and that's considered to be, service of food or whatever. Because if you've got beverages or ice or whatever, you'd have to have that food service meet the state of Michigan food service requirements.
And then who inspects it to ensure that I meet the standards for the state?
There are food service sanitation inspectors
For the state or for the city?
for. Well, at the time when I was working for the city, there were city inspectors. But I know that as time has evolved, the state of Michigan is now more active as far as inspecting city restaurants.
Okay, so
But I'm not really certain as far as the status of
So-
who does the inspection now.
let me see if I've got this down correctly. If I start a business like a coffee shop, there's at least 3 steps that I have to go through. I've got to deal with the state of Michigan, I've got to deal with the city, and I have to deal with the health department, correct?
Yeah, and dealing with the city, that includes also having proper zoning for that restaurant. You're not in a residential area. You're in an area where it's zoned properly in
And
a
if you-
commercial district.
And if you miss one of those steps, what's going to happen?
You're not going to get your license,
Okay,
or you'll
on
you'll
that note,
be
we'll be
told
back
false.
in a minute.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. Know your rights. Watch Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law, Tuesdays at 5 p.m. here on WHPR, Detroit Live.
You know, one of the things that I was curious about is I see a lot of these businesses opening up, and around the businesses, I see a lot of graffiti and a lot of blight. If I open a business, am I responsible for the graffiti that's in my building?
If you're the owner of the building, you are responsible for the graffiti on the building.
Well, how about if I'm just a tenant?
The way the property maintenance code reads now is that that is the responsibility of the owner of the building, who has the power to remove the graffiti from the building.
Now, can I get a ticket if there's graffiti on the building and I own the building?
That is correct. Under the property maintenance code, you could be issued a violation notice, and you could be issued an order to remove the graffiti from the building. And if you do not respond to that notice, the city or a contractor may come and remove the graffiti and send you a bill for it.
Now, if I have blight, and let's say I don't cut my lawn, or I allow debris to be stored around my building, let's say, I'm operating the cleaners,
Mhm.
and put all the old clothes outside in the corner over there that are no good and just leave them there. It makes a mess out there. Can I get a ticket for that?
Sure. You would be possibly issued a ticket under one of the environmental laws or the property maintenance code. Sometimes if it's a large amount of debris or clothing, for example, they may consider that to be illegal dumping, and the fines for that type of violation are kind of high.
Okay, suppose it's my house now, and I don't cut my lawn, and it gets to be real high, and I've got weeds all around the place. Can I get a ticket from the city for not maintaining my property?
Yeah. Property maintenance violation.
Okay, so does that happen very often?
Well, it's probably not, as far as high weeds, that may not be a priority as far as residential at this point, but it can happen.
But let's say I've got a garage and the roof is partially caved in. Can I get a ticket for that because it's unsafe?
That's correct. That gets into building code violations and some other things more so than a property maintenance. You may also have to get in a situation where you have to deal with the building department as far as abatement of that or destruction of that garage to come into compliance.
Okay, when I drive around Detroit, I see a lot of these safety doors on houses. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, with security bars. Do we have any ordinances about security bars in the city?
Well, I would say it primarily deals with the fire code. You can't barricade yourself into the house where you cannot get out, and there's release points or whatever. But that's primarily a fire issue. It may be an appearance issue dealing with the maybe the property maintenance code. But if you're in a historic district, that might be another issue as far as how you how the design and the exterior look of a security bar.
Okay, let's say I'm a landlord and I don't have a license to be a landlord. Can I get a ticket?
When you
So
say a
when you-
license to be a landlord, I want to characterize that as you haven't registered your property as rental property.
Okay, so,
And
so
there is a requirement under the property maintenance code that you register your property.
okay, this is really important. Does every person who rents property to another in the city have to register property as rental property?
Generally speaking, yes.
And why?
The city code, property maintenance code, our housing code basically requires that if you're going to accept money for space in a dwelling, you have to have that property registered with the city of Detroit. That registration process involves inspection. You must have a certificate of compliance. You must have a lead clearance. You must meet a list of things to be able to rent your property.
You're supposed to have a lead clearance? What's that?
Well, that's under the a lead clearance is a certificate issued that you have abated any lead violations within the premises or whatever. And there's people who have the expertise who will come out, look for chipping paint, look at dust that may contain lead or whatever, and you have to clean it up and get a sort of certification from the city that it's okay.
Well, what about asbestos? Do I need a clearance for asbestos?
For residential, I'm not familiar with that. I'm not sure whether there's a
But for
requirement for
commercial, you
that.
do, don't you?
Yeah, that's involved with a building code.
Right, an environmental issue.
You're right.
Okay, but back to the residential. So we got this lead abatement issue. What about checking the steps to make sure that the risers are good and that they're not cracks or defects? Because people, are paying you good money to rent your property. You have to keep it up, don't you?
That's correct. I mean, when you get your when you apply for your certificate of occupancy or certificate of compliance, the inspector will come out, look at those kinds of requirements as far as the stairs and everything in the building, make sure it's safe and habitable for the tenants.
Okay, so let me try this out for size. And if you're listening, this is real important for you to understand. You own a house, and I go into the newspaper and I see that your house is for rent. You with me?
Okay.
And I come over and look at your house and I want to rent your house. I can go down to the city to see if you have the right to rent your house, can't I?
Well, you have the right to rent your house, but you can go and see whether that house has been registered with the city for rental purposes.
That's my point.
Right. Okay.
But it's supposed to be registered for rental purposes, correct?
That's correct. That's public information.
And then I can go down to the city to see if there's a certificate of occupancy so that I can go in the house and habitate and live in there without worrying about the house falling apart, right?
At the time you move in, but who knows what may happen 2 months later or 3 months later or whatever.
No, but
it's
But there's supposed to be a certificate of occupancy as well, isn't there?
that is correct.
And if there isn't, they're enforceable, aren't they?
By the city, yes. I mean, that would be a violation. You could be issued a ticket, and the tenants could be asked to leave the building.
Or on the other hand, maybe you shouldn't have to pay the rent until things are fixed. Is that true?
I'm not sure what position the 36th District Court takes on that when you get a notice of eviction. I'm not sure, but it's my understanding is you can still file a notice of eviction whether you have complied with the city ordinance or not. That's an area that I haven't looked into.
Okay, well, I like that honest answer. But it's important, though, to check if you're going to rent a piece of property from another person to make sure that there's a certificate of occupancy, right?
That is correct, but in reality, the way the housing stock is in the city of Detroit, people sometimes they need a place and they'll move in, notwithstanding the lack of the registration or whatever the case might be. And the city has to aggressively go out and find these properties that have not been registered because there are lots of occupancies that are not registered with the city.
And when the city does that, they have a right to come in and shut them down if they don't meet the code, do they?
Well, initially they will issue a ticket or get at least a notice that this property needs to be registered. And then once the registration process begins, you have to obtain that certificate of occupancy and comply with the property maintenance code and the building code, electrical code, and all the other requirements to have residential occupancy of the building.
Okay, so if I rent one of these places and it's got a security door in the front of it, we have to make sure that it's a door that's acceptable to the city, correct?
Yeah, it meets the fire code. That's correct, yes.
Right, and the same thing, having smoke detectors and the like, right?
That's correct.
And having an exit, if there's a safety exit to get out of the house,
That's correct.
because has to be more than one means of ingress and egress, right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just trying to educate people
Right.
who are trying to get out of their own and find a place to live. If I'm running a car lot and selling cars, do I have to have a license to sell cars in the city?
You do. You have to have I'm not sure it's also tied into the state of Michigan, and you have to have the land has to be properly zoned, and there is a sales license. I'm not really sure what it's called, but I know that there is a way what the city can make sure that the land being used is in compliance with the zoning code. That's one of the bigger issues in the city of Detroit as far as operating of a used car lot, as far as where you're going to park the vehicles and whether there's any major mechanical repairs taking place. And it's that's an area that's gets kind of complicated.
Well, one of the biggest things that you've talked about so far as it relates to licensing, it's hand in glove. you need a license, but you also need to be zoned correctly.
That is correct.
And how do you determine if you're zoned correctly?
Go down and look at a zoning map. But no, normally what you would do is you would go down to the fourth floor of the city of Detroit, and there's a zoning counter. And if you know the address, they can go on their computer and they can locate where your address is within a certain zoning classification. And they can, and once you find that, look, if it's in a B1 or B2, you can go to the corresponding section of the zoning ordinance, and you can see what type of uses are permitted within that zoning district.
You know, I think what I'm getting out of this is a lesson that you have to investigate certain matters before you go into business in the city, correct?
Before you even think about it, as far as looking at any type of building or lot or whatever the case might be, you better make sure that the activity, the business activity that you're proposing is permissible for that piece of land, and make sure it's zoned correctly.
Okay, we'll be back in a few minutes.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. Know your rights. Watch Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law, Tuesdays at 5 p.m. here on WHPR, Detroit Live.
I understand that there's a new set of charges in the city called drainage charges.
That is correct. As far as the Department of Water and Sewerage has decided that they're going to charge about 20,000 parcels of land for the drainage that takes place.
Can you explain to me, here it's raining outside, I got a drain in my parking lot, and I want a 20,000 parcels. I'm not going to say they're all businesses, because they're not all businesses. Some of them are churches, right?
That's correct. Nonprofits are included.
Yeah, well, that's my point. Nonprofits don't pay for anything, do they?
Yes, they do. They have a water bill. But
Okay,
what's
well-
happening is that they're trying to expand that water bill to include a drainage charge.
Okay, what is a
And-
drainage charge?
Okay. Well, what happens is that the rainwater and the ice melt, et cetera, runs into what they call the combined sewer system. You know, with the sanitary water from your toilets, et cetera, and wastewater
okay.
that runs into a combined system, and all that stuff flows into the system.
Okay, into the force
And-
main. I got it.
That's correct. And from time to time, you know, I guess since about 1975, the city of Detroit, as far as residential, they began to have a separate drainage fee. But over the past couple of years, the city has decided that to look into trying to, for those properties that didn't have a separate water bill, for example, they do have water that's running on the parking lot and into the system, but there's no drainage charge because there's no water bill. So what the city has done is they've made evaluation and they've did surveys or whatever, and they're locating lots, parking lots and other land whereby the water is running into the system, and they've came up with a fee based upon the acreage that you would have to pay for that drainage into the city's combined sewer system.
So if I'm paying a water bill, I don't have to pay a drainage fee?
Yes, you do. You,
I want to make sure that we're clear here. You're going to have to pay a drainage fee, right?
Yes, and you look on a residential bill, you can see it itemized right now. I mean, there's a water bill, and then there's a drainage fee, which is separately stated on your individual
Why should I have to
resume.
pay a drainage fee for an act of God? When it rains outside, it's an act of God. Why should I, when it snows outside, it's an act of God. Why should I have to pay for that?
The water has to be cleaned before it's discharged into the environment. What happens is that your gutters or your parking lot drain or whatever, that all that water, as I stated, is running into the combined sewer system, and that water has to be subsequently discharged. It has to be cleaned before it's discharged back into the environment.
So when it's discharged back in the environment, where's it going?
It's going back into the Detroit River or whatever, just like all the other water that runs into the system.
Okay, so it's being recycled eventually, isn't it?
That's correct.
So when it goes back to the Detroit River, then it's got to go through the water department again, and it's going to be reprocessed, right?
Maybe. Yeah, what happens, I mean, of course, the water intake goes in, it's cleaned, and it's a cycle.
Well, how much do I have to pay for that?
Well, right now, I would say residential, the existing drainage fee, I was looking at my bill, it's the drainage fee is about $20 a month. But what's happening as far as the commercial parking lots and some of the larger surface areas, I think the fee is going to be, again, based upon the total acreage. And I don't have numbers in front of me, but it could be, again, it's based upon the amount of the acreage.
I understand. So the larger the mass of property, the greater the fee, because the more water has to be reprocessed before it goes back into the environment.
That is correct.
Okay. So if I own a factory and I've got 1,000 acres, I'm going to pay a lot of money in addition to running my factory.
That's another issue. If you're talking about the parking lot, that may be. I mean, but right now, there's of course, the industrial discharge permits. That's a whole other area as far as if you're operating a factory and you're using water in your operation. That's another issue. This is basically a drainage from storm water, ice melt, etc., that's going back into the system that has to be treated.
So everyone has to pay that.
That is correct, and the city's position is they want everyone to pay to make the system more equitable.
How do they enforce it?
They send you a bill. They do a survey, and they send you a bill.
And if you
And,
don't pay the bill, what happens?
Just like any other water bill. I mean, there's collection practices out there that you can do that. And there is a process whereby you can challenge the amount of the bill. And I know the city is starting to have workshops, and as people are coming online and questioning the amount of the bill, you can go down there, and there is a way that you can get a credit. For example, if you're collecting the water in rain barrels, for example, that you could appeal that and say, hey, all of my water is not going into the system.
Well, there you go. You got a bunch of rain barrels out in your backyard. You take pictures of them.
That's
And you
correct.
say,
And
you're going to use this for my hair. If you have any hair on top of your head, you're going to take care of reprocessing the water, right?
That's right. Well, arguably, if it's going into your garden there and it's not being, discharged into the system, you can make an argument.
Okay. Now I've got a real interesting question to ask you. I'm going to go into business, and I'm going to set up a hydroponics business. You know what a hydroponics business is, don't you?
I think I know what you're asking me.
I'm going to go into the growing of marijuana. Do I need a license to grow marijuana in the city?
I want to say there is no license to grow the marijuana. What's happened is that recently, the city of Detroit has began to license the dispensaries of the places that are selling or distributing their marijuana to the people.
Okay, and who regulates that, the city or the state?
Well, there was a ballot issue, and the state of Michigan allowed marijuana to be used for medicinal purposes, and now the city has a licensing scheme for those operations within the city, and that's issued if you have the correct or the proper zoning, and you can apply for a business license to do that.
Aha, now we're getting back to that old term again, zoning, right?
That is correct.
So you have to have the zoning in place.
Well, not only you have to have the zoning, there's lots of requirements within the zoning, and there's spacing requirements. You cannot be located so many feet to another regulated use like a bar or an adult cabaret, or it has to be so many feet away from a drug-free zone, which might be a school or a playground or a daycare center.
Are those covered in the ordinances of the city of Detroit, those distances, for example, for the dispensary?
That's correct. It's within the zoning ordinance.
Now, if I have a liquor establishment, isn't there a requirement that I'm a certain distance away from a school?
And a church, that's correct. There's certain requirements, that's correct.
So I just can't open up and have Barry's Liquor Store. I have to get a permit, it has to be in the proper zoning, and I have to go to the Liquor Control Commission and get a license, right?
A state license to
Yeah.
sell alcoholic beverages, that is
Okay.
correct.
And then it has to be a certain distance from schools and churches.
Right.
If I have a cabaret, do I have to have a license for a cabaret?
Yes, you do. You know, whether if you have a dance floor, basically we're talking about a cabaret, it's kind of a bar where you might have you're selling alcoholic beverages and food, but you may have a dance floor. So you would need a cabaret license. If you're operating an adult club, which is, you know, an adult cabaret, you'd have to have a license for that also.
How about if I have a bottle club?
A
We-
bottle club.
Sure, we all get together, we're friends, we can bring our liquor in and drink it, after hours. Is that legal or illegal?
If you're not selling it, it depends on what I would say. No comment on that.
Okay.
I'll leave that one alone.
Okay. I'm with you. I don't have a problem with it. I'm just trying to figure out what I need a license for.
Well, I'm not clear as far as when you say bottle club, so I don't want to venture
Okay.
into a territory that
Well,
I may
I
not
think
know
some
anything
folks
about
out there
right
understand what
yeah.
I'm talking about. But if I'm running a catering business out of the back of my house and I'm providing liquor along with the catering business for people, I need a license, and I need a license from the state of Michigan, right?
There may not be a license for catering out of the back of your home, especially if you're talking about alcoholic beverages. You know, that's a different animal. Again,
I'm talking about a combination of both
right.
of those.
Again, you got to look at the zoning classification that you're operating in, and if your house is probably in a R1 or R2 district, and you cannot operate most businesses out of your home.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, please, to tell our listeners what you believe they should do if they're going to start up a business in the city of Detroit. I'm going to give them 5 or 6 pointers, and they'll probably apply to any other place that they want to start a business. Because basically the rules are the same whether you're in Detroit or in Highland Park, or Oak Park, Allen Park. It's all the same, isn't it? Certain rules.
That is true. I mean, aside from the financial considerations of trying to do something like that or getting a bank loan and whatever, my response would be, again, dealing with you have to have a location that is zoned properly, and you also have to make sure that the activity is it would have to meet the zoning requirements as far as the spacing and the parking lot requirements, et cetera. All that's within the city ordinances, including zoning.
Well, why is parking so important that you have to meet it? You can't just people park on the street and
Well, that's the problem. People may be parking on the street and it might create traffic issues.
okay.
So you have to have sufficient parking. Someone will count the number of spaces you may have for your restaurant or your barber shop. And what would happen is that you may be able to get a variance if you don't have sufficient parking.
Now, who enforces this? Let's say I've got a pizzeria, and according to the space I have, I've only got 10 parking spots, but I need 20. And people are parking on the street. How's this enforced?
Well, initially, when you came in to open your business, I mean, they may have permitted it and granted you a variance to say that you could operate with 10 parking spaces. But if your parking needs grew, I mean, that would be your issue. I mean, and the city may not necessarily come out and close you down because you don't have sufficient parking. That becomes a business issue, I guess.
Well, one of the problems that I always see is when people go into business is that they're trying to find ways not to pay taxes, not to pay fees, not to pay for license, because all of those, don't have a
Cost
return.
of doing business.
Cost of doing business, but there's no return coming in for the cost of doing business. But what's the flip side of it if you don't do it?
Well, that goes back to square one. I mean, you should have sufficient capital before you made that decision to go into your business.
I understand, but we
but
all
you-
don't have sufficient capital. But tell us what the flip side is now. You're going to get a ticket, you're going to have enforcement, and you could be out of business, correct?
That is correct. And that's what happens, if you do not have sufficient capital to comply with all the regulations that are out there, including paying taxes on this little money that you're making.
Okay, if you run a business in the city of Detroit, do you have to pay a city tax on your business?
There are corporate taxes and individual taxes, of course, on income within the city of Detroit. Yes,
And do you have to file with the city?
yes, and
Okay.
you have to withhold payroll taxes too, for the city, and for the state, and for federal government.
Well, but there's a certain number of employees in order to do that you must have to qualify, correct?
That is correct, and I cannot tell you what that number is.
Okay, we'll take a break for a minute. We'll be right back.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. Know your rights. Watch Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law, Tuesdays at 5 p.m. here on WHPR, Detroit Live.
I asked you a lot of questions today about what you can do and you can't do to run a business. But I didn't get around to asking you, what can I do to run a business out of my house? I want to sell jewelry. Can I sell jewelry out of my house, or do I need a license?
I'm trying to think. This issue came out several years ago when I was working for the city, and I do not have an answer for that. I know that there's regulations dealing with that type of activity, but I cannot really respond to that question.
I mean, is there a zoning issue again? I want to run a pawn shop or a buy and sell, where you come in, you want to sell this watch, and I go over to Mr. Hudson's here, and Mr. Hudson's buy and sell watches. Do I have to have a license to do that?
Right. If you're going to have a full-time business operating a pawn shop, yes, you have to have a license to do that, and you'd have to have proper zoning to do that. And normally that type of activity is going to take place in a business or manufacturing zone. I hesitated about the residential piece because I know that there was some discussion about people who have these sales in their homes, whether they're working for Amway or whatever the case might be. I mean, some of that type of activity is permissible, but I'm not really sure what the state of the law is on that. And also, the regularity of that, just for example, the yard sales, you can have periodic yard sales, but you can't do that on a regular basis.
If you do it on a regular basis, you have to have a license, don't you?
There may not be a license to do that on a regular basis, but you can pull a permit. Years ago, it's so long since I looked at this, but years ago you could have a yard sale, or a neighborhood could have a yard sale, but there's always been that one person in the neighborhood who has clothes or items out for sale on a regular basis, and that's frowned upon, and they have tried to enforce different types of zoning restrictions in that regard.
One of the reasons they try and enforce these is because if you're in a residential area, if somebody's got a bunch of clothing out on racks in front of their house, it's like having blight in the neighborhood, isn't it?
Some would say, call it that, yes.
And it causes disruption in the neighborhood.
Some may say that, yes.
You're such a kind man, some would say. But in reality, this is what happens.
That's correct, but it depends on whether you're at a corner house and what's going on and what your other neighbors think about that.
I understand. But for the most part, you have to have a license to do these things.
Or a permit. There may not be a business license for the types of activities you're talking about, but it may be.
Now, here's a really interesting question, which you may not have the answer to, but we'll work through together. I decided to set up an online business. And you can Google me up, see that I sell shoes, jackets, shirts online. But I got a warehouse in the garage. Do I have to be correctly zoned to have that warehouse in the garage for my distribution center?
Again, if you're doing something that's not permitted or allowed in a residential area, you may not be able to get a license to operate your warehouse in your backyard. I mean, if it's a huge warehouse operation, you have to be in a business or probably a manufacturing district to do something like that.
How does the city of Detroit regulate online businesses?
They don't regulate online businesses except in what your example is that if you're actually have physical goods in your garage, or there's some type of activity that's there, business activity like the boxes or cartons or commercial vehicles loading and unloading things, they would regulate that. But if you're just on your computer doing things from shipping things online or whatever, I don't think there's any regulation
But
in that respect.
there's billions of dollars in tax dollars that are lost. And I said billions of dollars in tax dollars that are lost every year because of online transactions. And the city of Detroit must be losing a lot of revenue because if I run a store, you can get my records and you can physically see how much business I'm doing, correct?
But you're talking about a sales tax. I mean, I think
A sales
the
tax,
state
yeah.
of Michigan is losing lots of money
But the
from
city,
that. But
city of Detroit gets some revenue based upon your income, correct?
That is correct. There might be an income tax on the wages that you might have on your
Or the earnings.
or your plan. Yeah, that's correct.
Right. How do you regulate it? What can you do? Can I come in and say, well, Mr. Hudson, we tracked you down and you've got a very profitable online business and you're in the city of Detroit. We want to see how much income you're generating to determine whether you should pay taxes. What do you think about that?
I don't have any opinion on it right now. This is a new area for me. You're asking me something hypothetically, which I'm not really sure how the city, or whether they have to deal with it now. Of course, again, I think most of the revenue that's lost tax-wise is based upon a sales tax, the lack of a sales tax on online transactions.
Right, but would you agree with me that all these online businesses are interfering with the small businesses in the community?
No, because I would imagine that a lot of small businesses are moving in that direction as far as having online sales. So I'm not going to really say that they would be in opposition to that. That's
Okay, so it's not an issue then in terms of regulation.
I have no comment on that. As far as I
Okay.
don't think that there is an issue at this point in time.
Now, at the present time, you indicated to me that occasionally you still go to court on some of these matters, correct?
Over the last 2 or 3 years, I have been down to the Department of Administrative Hearings, where they conduct the blight violation hearings.
Oh, tell us how those work at administrative hearings. What do they handle down at administrative hearings? Just blight?
That's correct. The violations of the property maintenance code and certain environmental code violations,
What about the graffiti tickets? Are they handled there?
they handle those also.
Okay.
And
What about rent issues?
well, what happens if you are renting and you fail to have a certificate of compliance, you can be issued a violation notice under the property maintenance code, and you would go before the Department of Administrative Hearings for
Okay.
those violations.
Can you explain how the Department of Administrative Hearings works?
Well, basically, a violation is issued, and you are a court date is specified on the ticket itself. They have City of Detroit hearing officers, and it proceeds just like a trial, but it's an administrative case, and it's over the these are civil violations, and they're non-criminal matters, and you have to appear. If you fail to appear, they will issue a default notice.
If I file a complaint against you, can I have a hearing, administrative hearing, if I believe you're in violation? Or does the citation have to come from the city?
That is correct. The City of Detroit inspector would issue that ticket, and that's the charging party. would
Can I
be
file a
providing-
complaint in the city? And
They would investigate it and subsequently issue a violation notice.
how would I
And
file a
it's like
complaint?
Well, you could call one of the departments and indicate, what facts there are as far as that would support a violation, and the inspector would come out, do an inspection, maybe issue a warning, but most likely issue a violation notice.
Now, if the inspector doesn't come out, what do I do? Call the ombudsman?
I'm not sure about what the ombudsman, how they would respond to that, but I would suggest that you try to contact somebody within the one of the inspecting departments, whether it's and also maybe the police department, depending on what type of violation it might be.
So if I have a health and safety issue related to the place that I'm renting, I can call the building department or the health department, file a complaint, correct?
Yes, you could.
If they come out and inspect and they determine there's a violation, they can cite the landlord, correct?
That is correct.
And then they would have an administrative hearing.
Yes, unless you just flip over the ticket, and just like a parking ticket, you can pay your ticket prior to the hearing.
Well, if you get a ticket, is there more than just paying it? Because that may be the easy route. Is there a compliance requirement?
Yes, but very often what happens is that if you issued a violation, and if you pay the ticket, but if you do not correct or abate the violation, they can issue a ticket the next day.
But this process can go on and on and on. It's like getting parking tickets every day. And you get the parking ticket, and you go back to the same spot, and you park again, you get another parking ticket.
That is correct.
Well, what about enforcement? Isn't there enforcement?
At some point, as far as collection, or just as far as
To
enforcement,
stop the ongoing problem.
yeah. It depends on whether it rises to a level of a nuisance or that needs to be abated. It just depends on the circumstance.
Okay. If it's a nuisance that has to be abated, what happens?
Well, in the case of, depending on how the ordinance is written, say for example, you talked about graffiti, there's a declaration within the ordinance that this is deemed basically a nuisance, and the city of Detroit may hire a contractor or someone else will go out there and actually abate the violation, remove the graffiti from the wall or from the building.
I think the most important thing we learned today is that if you're going to run a business, run it in the proper zoning environment, correct?
That's correct.
Secondly, if you have a complaint, there's an administrative process that you can use to have an administrative hearing within the city of Detroit to hold your landlord accountable for not maintaining your property.
But that is a matter of making a complaint to a city department that would actually issue the violation
Well,
notice.
we don't want frivolous complaints. We want actual, honest, bona fide complaints, correct?
Right, but I guess my key point is that my point is that the inspector itself would have to issue the violation notice. The citizen doesn't file the complaint, so to speak.
Anyone who's listened in today, if you have any questions regarding these matters, feel free to call me at 1-800-LAW-USA-1. Thanks for listening today, and have a good week.